join me on a quilting tale today. My name is Shaylin, and this is the second video in a series I'm doing about making a quilt from the book The Farmer's Wife 1930s Sampler Quilt. And if you missed my first video, I gave an overview of the project I'm planning on doing. I'm going to make 36 blocks from this book. Originally I had said 30, but I changed up the layout that I want to do and made a new setting for it. And so I'll do 36 blocks from this book. And so the first video just gave a history of the 1930s reproduction fabric, what it was inspired by, the feed sack fabrics that were used during that era, and just the necessity of being resourceful during that era. And so that video covers some history as well as the characteristics of the fabric of that time, and I show several of the fabrics that I've pulled and collected over the last couple years, including some actual feed sacks. And so I have a lot of fabric to play with and make these blocks. So that was the first video. Please check it out if you missed it. And I'm so happy if you're here because of that video when you want to follow along on this project. So in this video, I'm going to be focusing on how to foundation paper piece, which is the way that these blocks are pieced. And I had a great question, do you have to foundation paper piece for these blocks? I would say no, not on all of them. There are some blocks that if you study the diagrams, you can see, there's half square triangles and some stitch and flip and just some plain old squares or rectangles. And so you might be able to do some math and use some graph paper to figure it out, but the book does not have directions for traditional piecing. And then there are some pieces that I think would just be very challenging to achieve the shape of without foundation paper piecing. So my hope is that after watching this video, if you've never foundation paper pieced before, you'll feel inspired to give it a try, and hopefully I will make it seem a little simpler than it might be, because I know I was putting off trying it for a while. It seemed kind of backwards and complicated to me, but after you do a few blocks and get the hang of it, you really will be happy with the results, just the sharp points you can get and how things line up, and again, those odd shaped pieces of the block that would be hard to get doing another way. So this video will give a demonstration of how I make one of the blocks from this book. I'll be making the Lucy block in this tutorial, which is block number 53, I believe. But really the method for doing this is going to be the same no matter which block you do. So let's get started. I'm going to show you how to use the book, some materials you'll need for foundation paper piecing, and then I'll demonstrate how I made this block. The patterns that I'll be making come from this book, The Farmer's Wife 1930s Sampler Quilts by Lori Aaron Hurd. And I have the pages all marked up with the 30 blocks that I want to make and some quotes that I like. And so there are detailed directions in the front of the book for how to use the book, and a little bit of background about the Farmer's Wife magazine and the women behind these blocks and the era that they're from. So there's some good history in there. But what you'll really want to check if you get this book is how you'll access the templates and diagrams. So the version I have has a CD, and so that's something to consider. I had to find a little portable DVD player that plugged into the computer to open this disc, because our tower doesn't have a disk drive anymore. And so maybe newer versions of this book, if there are newer versions, have a different way of accessing the diagrams, but that's just something you might consider, is how you'll get the patterns. But once you open the CD, there are different things you can print. One are the templates, and I'm going to be making the Lucy block. This is number 53. And so there's templates that you can print to actually cut out all your pieces, leaving enough for the seam allowance. And I'll talk a little bit about how I use these in a moment. But another important thing is there is a 1-inch scale on all the pages, and when you print these you want to make sure you print at 100%, not fit to page. That way they'll come out the right size, and you can use a ruler and test that it is truly 1 inch. I would also make sure if you're printing these you print on the same printer, just for consistency's sake. And then the other pieces that you'll print are how they go together, and there's a lettering system. Sometimes there's numbers, sometimes there's both, and I'll go into detail about how those work a little later. But you'll want to print both of those for each block that you choose to make. On a side note, if you are doing a foundation paper piecing pattern that doesn't have the templates for the pieces to cut out like this book does, you can always make your own. So this is another project that I'm working on. I'm doing a Storm at Sea quilt with completely different fabrics. But what I did was just take regular computer paper, and I traced, you know, each of these shapes. Like number 5 here, I traced this triangle, and then I just cut, you want at least a 1/4 inch around it. You could be even neater and do it with a ruler, but I just kind of eyeballed it and cut it out. And then when I cut out my shapes, here's some that I've already cut out, I didn't even, you know, trim precisely along the template. I just did a little more on the outside, and that ensures I have enough seam allowance to cover the shape that I want. So I did that, and I also numbered the templates so I know what pieces they go to. But I did that for all the pieces that I'll be using to make those blocks. And so that's something else you can do if you're not provided with templates. So some other materials you'll want besides your diagrams and your template, you'll want a cutting mat, and a rotating cutting mat is really handy, or if you have just a smaller one that you can pick up and move around. Sometimes it's just easier to be able to rotate the board instead of move all the pieces. You'll want some kind of pressing mat and an iron. I'm just using my small project iron here because there aren't big pieces in this one. You could get some kind of clapper or something to really flatten the seams with the paper. That's optional. You're gonna need rotary cutters. These small ones, this is a 28mm, has been really handy for dealing with such small pieces. Like in this book, we're making 6-inch finished blocks, so the pieces are small. And then perhaps a larger one for just cutting more strips of fabric if you have lots of pieces to cut. Making strips is helpful. Then you'll want some rulers to get straight edges. You can use any size depending on how much fabric you're using and the amount of fabric you're cutting. You'll want regular paper cutting scissors because you'll be cutting out templates, and I'm just using plain old copier paper. I wouldn't use anything much thicker than that. And then I use Best Press just to get my pieces a little flatter and stiffer. Again, optional. Some people starch, some people just iron with steam and water. But whatever you do, I would treat your fabric with whatever liquids you use first before cutting out the pieces, because they can shrink a little. And if you use these templates exactly and then the fabric shrinks a bit, you'll be short covering the pieces of the block. So any type of fabric treatment you do that prior to cutting out these pieces. And finally, you'll need some fun fabric. And so if you saw my first video, you know I'm using 1930s inspired prints and colors. And so this print here that I'll be demonstrating with today is called Vintage 30s Florals by Sarah Morgan for Washington Street Studio. I'm also going to be using 2 Kona solids. This blue one is called Blue Jay, and this red one is called Lipstick. So let's get started. So So the first thing I'm going to do is cut out my paper templates that I printed off of the CD. And like I said, you could trace the shapes and leave at least a 1/4 inch, and I say at least, I would do more than that, seam allowance. But on here it just means cutting along the dotted line. And I actually go a little beyond the dotted line, just barely, because when you're trimming, if you're planning on trimming right up to the template and you shave some off, you get a little too close, your pieces might end up smaller. After making a few of these blocks, I just use the templates as a rough guide. I spent a lot of time cutting the fabric exactly with them, and most of them turned out nice, but some of them did come up just a little shy of making it to the edge of the fabric. I'm sorry, making it to the edge of the block. And so I figured if it's a little more oversized than this, that's okay. It's better to have a little more than think you have just the right amount and then you come up short, if that makes sense. And these block patterns come with all different shapes. This one is mostly just triangles and squares, but there's rectangles and some odd looking shapes. I chose this one because there's just fewer shapes to work with. I can put this one together a little quicker here to demonstrate, but no matter the shape, you're going to do the same thing. There's a diagram on each printout. You can use it to do a color layout and see if you like certain fabrics, if you'd like that color combination on there. That's what I've been using those for. Alright, so when it's time to prep and cut the fabric, something I did on each template was put how many of each color I need for the piece. So like this little triangle, I'll need 16 in the solid blue. In this little square, I need 8 red and 8 in my floral print. I need 4 blue and 4 print on this one, and just 1 of the print on this one. So since I'm doing red right now, this is the only one I need. And you can see this is a very small square, so I don't need to use much of this fabric. And I went ahead and got a 1/2 yard of each solid that I picked out, because I just wasn't sure how much I'd need. And because these are so small, I think I'll have plenty left over, even after doing the 30 blocks. But I'm just going to fold in half here so my selvages are together. Get my cutting mat, oops. Get my cutting mat underneath. And I will trim off my selvages. And then all I do is I take my template, I'll swing it over here. There's the fold. I take my template and I just place it so there's a little space around, because I haven't done any pre-shrinking of the fabric. I haven't sprayed it with anything, and so I want to make sure I have a little extra, because when I spray it I expect it to shrink a little bit. So I might trim it about like this, and that should still give me plenty, because really what I want is to the dotted line, but I have some extra there. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that, and then spray it and prep it, and then cut out 8 of these little squares. Okay, so now this part, you can use a ruler. I would use a ruler if the pieces were smaller, but because these are so little, I'm just gonna hold the square down with my finger, and I'm just gonna make a cut. And so you can see I have plenty of fabric on each side of it. It'll cover what I need. So I'm gonna cut out 8 of these. And if they're not perfectly square, that's okay, because the excess will get cut off and you'll have a nice perfect square once it's sewn in with the foundation paper piecing. And then I'll save this because another pattern might call for small squares and I might want to use red. And I don't want to forget, I also need 8 of the print. So these were the only reds that I need. So I'm going to finish cutting out the pieces the exact same way. When I get to the triangles, I will show you what I do with the triangles to get the angle there. I'm on the print fabric now, and I need 1 square, and I always like to see, are there other pieces that are of a similar size? So if I make a strip, you know, I don't have to just cut out 1 little square here, but maybe I can get multiple shapes out of the same strip. And I think I can with this one, because this looks to be like the square cut in half. And so I'm going to, again, cut a little generously on the side down my strip here, and I'll show you how I cut out the triangles. Okay, this one is a little bigger, and so I'm going to use the ruler here. Just to cut out that first square. That's all I need. That's my center. If you had something you wanted to fussy cut, you might hold the template in front. Like if I wanted that cherry in the middle there, just kind of move it around the fabric and then use the template to cut it. That's an option too. Because the fabrics I'll be using in this quilt are so small and scattered, I won't be using much fussy cutting, if any at all. But that's something to consider if you do have something nice you want to put in the middle of a block. Okay, so now for the triangles, and since this has a right angle, I'm going to use the right angle of my strip here to line up and not go right to the edge. I'm still going to leave some excess, but I'm going to just trim a little past the paper like so. You can trim off these points here if you wanted to trim it a little bit. I think it's fine. It just means you have that much room for any errors, so I tend to leave them. You could trim exactly along the dotted line. That was the original intent of these templates, to get the exact amount, and every little angle here will match up perfectly if you cut it out well. But like I said, I found I was coming up just barely shy of getting to the 6-inch finished size, and so I just find it better to give yourself a little bit of extra. So now I'm going to take this curve and I'm going to align the hypotenuse, the side opposite the right angle, to that slope there, and then I'm going to just cut a straight line up and down. So again, I have a little bit more than what the template is requiring, and then I'll turn it back over again so my right angle is aligned. And I will just finish. I need 4 of these, so I'll spin my template around again and cut a vertical line. And now I've ensured that I have enough to cover the triangular portion of the block. So let me finish cutting out all my fabric pieces and then we will start sewing. I still have this piece left over and I have 8 of these little squares to make, so I can get probably 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. I can get them all out of this strip, so I'll make sure to do that rather than cut really skinny strips like I did with the red. So just look at what you have left over and start with your bigger pieces, because then you might be able to get more small ones if you need them with what's remaining. My roughly cut pieces are ready to use, so now it's time to cut out the block templates. So the Lucy block has several pieces to cut out. A lot of these aren't even going to be sewn onto other pieces. They'll be attached to segments that you'll sew together. But what's important to look at is the lettering. This book uses a lettering system, and so you'll have 3 A pieces and it will show you which pieces to sew together. You always start with the line between 1 and 2, so you're going to sew these 2 squares together, and then after that you'll put A3 together and that will complete a segment. Then you'll do the same thing with B, sewing B1 and 2 together on this line, followed by B3 on this line. So that's a segment. And then there are directions that will say which pieces to join to which, so just leave all your pieces, you know, sewn together, whether they're segments or single pieces, and it will tell you which pieces to sew together once you have them all ready to go. So I'm going to cut each of these out along the dotted line. Again, if you leave just a hair around the dotted line when you trim, that'll ensure you don't over trim. But this one you don't want to do roughly, because you want to make sure that your pieces are covering just to the dotted line or a little beyond. You don't want to have big pieces that you're trying to cover and it feels like you don't have enough fabric. Whatever you do, do not cut on the solid line. That's your finished size. So the dotted line represents your seam allowance. Alright, I've got all my pieces cut out and there are lots of them, but there aren't many to attach. A lot of these are just single pieces that don't actually need to be joined to other pieces right away. They will join later, but I can prep those now without sewing. Something I forgot to mention that might be helpful is some kind of glue. This is the English paper piecing sew line glue pen. This works well, or you could just use Elmer's glue, any kind of washable glue, a glue stick. Pins are helpful too. I feel like if you have bigger pieces, like the other Storm at Sea foundation paper piecing project I'm doing, they have larger pieces and I find the pins to be helpful. With pieces as small as these, I mean, you can see my fingernail for comparison to some of these sizes. I think just holding them in place is fine. But these single ones that I want to trim precisely along the dotted line, I'm going to put a dab of glue just to keep them from moving around. So I'm going to do that first, and then we'll get to sewing the pieces that have more than one shape in the segment. I'm keeping my colored diagram handy. I just colored in with colored pencils and made a key for which, like the yellow is my print fabric, and then there's a blue and red solid. And so these tell me the letters, like R1 corresponds to the R1 square here, and I know that's going to be the print. And so this just helps me make sure I keep my pieces straight. And I use the diagram that is over the piecing instructions. There's another one that comes on the template, the shape templates to just cut out the fabric. And that one is slightly different. It has different lettering system that matches the shape size of the template. So just be aware that there are 2 of them. But let's do R1. That is just my solid piece here. And whether you're sewing or doing a single piece like this one, you're always starting with the back side of the template, or the wrong side without the print is going to attach to the wrong side of your fabric. So you're always going to start with wrong sides together with your first piece of fabric. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue, trying to avoid the seam allowance, just kind of aim for the middle there because I don't want to sew through my glue or anything. Not that it would be a big deal, but I'm just going to press that down. And you could even, I think sometimes it helps the glue to adhere a little, just give it a quick press with the iron. And so that would be the first piece. And you can see I have excess, and since this is the only thing I need it for, I can trim this now. So this one I want to use a ruler, and I'm going to cut right on those dotted lines. And if you can't see the dotted lines, or you feel like maybe I've over trimmed, you can line up the 1/4 inch line of your ruler onto the solid line. You know, you can line it up to the bottom of your shape just to make sure it's not going crooked. But you just want to make sure you have that 1/4 inch seam allowance from your solid line. And this is where your rotating mat might be handy, just because of how I'm set up with the camera and all my iron next to me. I'm just going to turn the piece, but using the rotating mat can make it go a little more smoothly too. My camera battery died, so I'm not exactly sure what got cut off in that last part I was saying, but basically I'm just trimming to the 1/4 inch line, and so you might see just a tiny bit of those dotted lines left, but you want a nice square piece. And you can see oversizing it, I didn't have a terrible amount of waste there, but I ensure I have enough to cover the shape, including the seam allowance. So I'm going to do the same thing now with my little single triangles here. I've put what are half square triangles in a pile, and then these triple piece segments in a pile, which I'll do on the machine in a moment. But I'm going to prep these, and I want to pay close attention to the letters. Like this one I grabbed says M1, and so I'd want to make sure I match it to the M1 fabric. Now all of these little triangles are blue, so I don't have to put much thought into it, but if they were different, just make sure you're matching them up. So I'm going to take these, and the nice thing about solids is, you know, you can't really tell what's the right or wrong side, but just remember you want the wrong side of the paper, the part that doesn't have the print, and the wrong side of the fabric, and you just want to make sure it's fully covered. And so these ones are real tiny, so I'm just going to put a little dab of glue. I can kind of see through with the light that I'm dabbing off of any lines, and I'll just press that in. And then these ones I'm going to cut real carefully because there are some tiny little angles to cut. So there's one long line, but then there's just this tiny little piece to trim and another tiny piece. So even though it's a triangle, the finished size is a triangle, there are more than 3 cuts. So I'm just going to be very careful that I'm cutting each of those pieces, because that will make it fit perfectly with the segments later. So you'll see that when it comes time. Okay, so there's that piece, and on the back you can see the shape there. So I'm going to finish doing that, then we'll get to sewing. when it's time to do the segment pieces that have more than one piece, like this one has 3, you can fold along the lines you're going to sew on, the solid lines. This will help you later to trim the seam allowances to 1/4 inch if you have oversized fabric pieces. Now if you cut exactly what was on the template, your 1/4 inch seam allowances should be just where they need to be and you shouldn't have to trim. But like I said, I found I still came up a little short sometimes, so I'm doing this oversized method. But I'm just gonna fold, and I've seen some people use like a credit card or a business card or something to kind of wedge up in there, but I'm just kind of eyeballing it and, you know, using my fingers to guide where to crease. But I have those 2 lines there. And so I'm gonna start with A1 and A2. And again, I'm always looking at my diagram. So I see that A1 is red, A2 is my print. So I'm going to get one of each of those squares. And on the back, I'm going to make sure red is on the back of A1. And if this was a printed fabric, I'd want to make sure that I'm putting wrong sides together. I'm always connecting the fabric to the unprinted side of the paper. And so you always start with wrong sides together. Now again, solid doesn't matter so much, but the first piece that goes down is always right side facing up. From there, when you attach another piece, it's always right sides together. And so since I'm attaching A2 right here, you can probably see through the window with the light there that the fabric extends at least 1/4 inch beyond that stitch line there. There's A1 and A2. So I'm going to attach right sides together my pieces, and you could pin on the line that you're going to be sewing on. This is totally optional, but when you're first starting, this might be helpful. Pin right there. That's going to represent your stitch line, and then you can take that piece, because after you sew on this side, you're going to press your fabric like this, and it should completely cover that A2 square plus the seam allowance. So you can see that A2 plus the seam allowance around it is covered. So that's what you're looking for, and that's why doing it oversized a little bit I think is helpful, because if you do it exactly and then you fold over, you might lose a little bit of your fabric, and then, you know, you might end up with something like this where there's, which is what happened in the beginning with me, there's just a tiny bit that can still be covered when you sew in the seam allowance, but I would just rather make sure the whole piece is covered. So let's take this to the sewing machine and I'll give you some tips for sewing. To help with removing the papers later, you should reduce your stitch size to 1.5. My machine does 1.4 or 1.6, so I opted for 1.6. They're just a little bigger, but it's easier if I have to remove stitches later to take them out if they're a little bigger, and 1.6 still works. When you're ready to sew your first line, you want to back stitch at the beginning and end of the line. And you can go just past the first line into the next piece, but just make sure you back stitch. And then you can trim these longer threads either now or later. And you may also finger press and attach the next piece, or I opt to iron here. All right, then you're going to take your iron. You can press it a bit, and now we're going to trim. If you had cut the exact pieces, the trimming portion here shouldn't be necessary with this book because they've accounted for your seam allowance and given you exactly what you need. But if this is your first time doing foundation paper piecing, or you haven't done it in a while like I have, I highly recommend giving yourself a little bit of extra and just trimming down. And it might become easier as you do more of it, but I think this just makes sure that you're not coming up short. So where you folded between A1 and 2, you're going to just fold A2 down, and then you should have about 1/4 inch if you were kind of eyeing it, but anything you have extra you want to trim down. So you're going to align your 1/4 inch line of your ruler to the paper where you folded, and you're just going to trim. And I don't have a whole lot there. It was at 1/4 inch, but if one piece had stood out farther, you know, I could trim it to size. You just want to be careful that you don't have the piece you sewed on sticking out there. You just want the seam allowance and everything else folded under. And so then you have this piece ready to go. You can also fold along the second line, this line here, fold down, and I can see that I have more than 1/4 inch here. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to trim 1/4 inch away from that paper. And now when I go to align my A3 piece, I just have to line it up to this straight line here, and I know I'm 1/4 inch away. So here's my A3 piece. I'm going to line it up so that there's a little bit of triangle overhanging on each side of the paper. Again, if you're unsure, you can take a pin, put it through that stitch line you're going to do, like that, and then fold it up. And because I oversize these, I definitely have enough paper here. You can see it's extending well beyond the seam allowance portion, the dotted portion there. Again, any piece you add to a segment from here on out, you're going to put right sides together. So it's only the very first piece that has the right side facing up, but everything else, when you place it down, the right side should be touching what you've already sewn, and the wrong side should be up. So I know that's kind of hard to tell because I'm using solid fabric and it looks the same. But first piece again is right side up, always sewn to the back of the template, the part that's not printed, and then all subsequent pieces will be right sides together, so the wrong side is pointing up at you. And so it doesn't matter if you're attaching 3 pieces or 10 pieces, you're always going to have wrong side up if it's the second piece or beyond. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch again down this line here. You can trim these threads if they're in your way and bothering you, but you're going to start a little in the seam allowance and go a little into the seam allowance here. Make sure you back stitch because that helps when you're ripping the paper out later. I like to give it a press before trimming down, or trimming seam allowances even, just because I think it makes it nice and flat, and then you can always repress if you trim seam allowances. But this one should be matched up pretty well because I already trimmed the seam allowance. And so now all that's left to do, because you'll get something that doesn't look very good, it looks a little wonky, but we'll trim now to get our segment. So let me bring this back. And again, I'm just trimming right on the dotted line. Again, you can line up your 1/4 inch mark to the solid line to make sure you haven't trimmed off too much. And this will just ensure that the pieces all fit nicely together later on. And trimming it down often takes care of a lot of those long, loose threads, which is why I don't always bother trimming them. But there's that first little segment. It's nice and clean. And so I'm going to finish making the rest, and then I'll show you how to sew the segments together. If you make an error, like I have here, you can see I put my first piece with the right side down, which I didn't want to do. So I need to take that out. This is where that stitch length, where I had to choose 1.4 or 1.6 because I didn't have 1.5, comes in handy. The smaller your stitch length, the harder it is to get those stitches out. You'll have more of them to get out. So 1.6, if you don't have 1.5, works well for tearing, but also if you're making errors, it's easier to get those pieces out. So what I would do is, if you can, use your seam ripper on the side with the fabric, not the paper. First of all, it's harder to see the white thread on the white paper, but you also don't want to accidentally tear your paper. So if you can, do the fabric side. And because I backstitched, those first few stitches might be a little tougher to get out, but I'm just trying to get my seam ripper under every other stitch or so. I'm trying to make sure it's showing up in the camera and watching what I'm doing, but every other stitch or so. Unfortunately, these are small, so it's not a lot of stitches. But then you can take it, and a lot of times it just comes right off. You could also loosen it a bit, lift it, and run your seam ripper to anything that didn't quite loosen. But then you can just pull those threads out and start again. If you made a mistake and realized, oh, my fabric didn't cover the portion I needed it to, and you'd already pressed, you'd want to press your fabric flat again, but that wasn't the case here. So you can see there's those little perforated holes there. I wouldn't do it more than 2 or 3 times in the same spot. You might start losing your line there, but it's still usable. So now I'm going to do that again. My C1, I'm going to make sure this is C1 down here, right side's up this time, hanging over at least 1/4 inch on both sides of the line. Then I'll put my red fabric with the wrong side facing up, so right sides together. Because these are so small, I don't pin. If I had bigger pieces, I would pin it, but I'm just going to hold it there and restitch that line again. As I prepare this half square triangle piece, I thought I'd share another tip with you. You can use your light, or if you have a light box, anything to help you see that fabric extending 1/4 inch beyond the sew line is helpful. And so you've seen me use the window, but using my lamp at my sewing table is also another source that can help make sure I have enough seam allowance before I sew. So like I did before, I'm going to start a little in the seam allowance, or a little before my stitch line, back stitch, and then when I get to the end, I'll go just beyond the stitch line into the seam allowance and back stitch again, just to secure those stitches when I tear out the paper. So I know I'm going into a lot of detail in this tutorial, and I hope you're finding it helpful. I know I appreciate hearing the reasoning and the thought process behind quilters' decisions, and so that's what I'm trying to do here. But I'm just going to trim this piece up now, and we'll finish up all these little pieces before sewing the segments together. When you're ready to connect your segments, use your diagram to see which pieces to join. Like I'm going to join pieces A and B together, and it tells me the order to sew them, so I want to pay attention to that. You're going to put the pieces right sides together, and they often will nest for you, so make sure you're nesting when you can. And then you can use a pin to make sure that the stitch line is going to hit both of those solid lines. So if you need to make some adjustments, you can, if you need to move a piece up or down. But then you're going to sew just like before, starting in the seam allowance, back stitch, and then down that solid line. You can take out your pin, and then when you get to the end, just go a little beyond into the seam allowance and back stitch again. And if you lined up with your pins, you should have a stitch line on both solid lines on each side. So when you open it up, everything is nice and square. And then you can press open the seams. You could iron them here if you'd like. I'm just going to finger press just for speed's sake here. But then at this point, I tear the seam allowance pieces out. So I fold down the middle and then tear to the sides rather than start at the ends where I back stitched. And I tried this earlier, not tearing out the papers, and I found it more difficult to remove these later when they got sewn into additional seam allowances. So that's why you'll see me when I make these blocks just tear out the seam allowance as soon as I've sewn one. And then again, you can iron it flat. So now I'm following, I see I need to connect the S piece to the AB piece, this larger one in my left hand here. And I'm just, again, following the diagram to see where to connect. And I will make sure that those short little angles line up with the edges. That's why they were cut there. And use my pin again to make sure that it's going through both solid lines on each side. So this one I might need to do just a tad bit of adjustment. There it goes. And then I use the pin to hold them in place, and I will sew just like before. So right now you probably know the drill. Back stitch, sew, and back stitch at the end. Lining up those little flat edges, make it so that when you open it, you get a perfectly straight line going across on both sides. So those little flat angles are really helpful for this portion. And so once again, I'll just finger press open and tear out those papers. And then that's the process. You just keep going until you have all your segments attached. When I press the seams open, I just use a dry iron, so don't use steam. And then you can use your clapper, and most of the pieces are so small, a clapper will cover it, but I'm just going to let that sit there and flatten the seams as I make the other units. There's what those pressed pieces look like, and I have 4 of them now. So I'm going to just lay out the block because now I'm really just making a 9 patch. So I'm going to follow the diagram here and just lay out my pieces according to the directions. And just make sure they're oriented the correct way. So some of them, the red are going vertically, and some the red is going horizontally. So I just want to make sure that that is consistent. And since they're squares, I really can, as long as the red is going horizontally or vertically like it's supposed to, I can flip it if I like, you know, something that's in the square better showing up. So the solid blue should be in all the outer corners. So now I have that ready. I'm going to go ahead and stitch these two together, these two, and then I'll add those and then do the rows. I'm going to sew the other side on it now, and then I'll press and remove the seam allowance papers. I'm putting the side that has the point on top, the part that I'll see when I sew, just because I want to make sure I don't cut that point off. I just want to make sure that I'm hitting right under where that fabric folds there. So I just want to watch the points. Alright, so there is the top row. So I will press all of these seams open, and I'll tear out that paper. There are my 3 rows now sewn together. So I'm going to just sew these rows again just along this long continuous black line. So I'll put a few pins in there and make sure they're staying aligned. Press those seams open, and then I'll do the same for the bottom. When it's time to attach it, just sew along the solid black line. So I'm just trying to nest the seams first. So I'm actually going to connect in the seam points first and just make sure that my needle is touching both sides, both lines on each side, I should say. And then I can put a pin in the corner to hold the ends down. And then same thing, I want to make sure that this pair of seams is nesting. And once it is, just make sure that the lines are one on top of the other. This one looks like it needs to be scooted up just a tad bit. There we go. Alright, and then I'm going to hold the end here. Okay, so I can see my points are sharp there, and the point is sharp there, so it's looking good. And again, I'll just press all of these seams open and tear the paper out. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the last portion, and then I'll show you the final result. There's my finished Lucy block. I love how it turns out. The blue makes a little star around this center print, and then it's just framed in nicely with the red with those fun 30s colors. So the very last thing that I'll do on the back, you can see I have the seams pressed open. I'm going to remove all the paper pieces that are not touching the final seam allowance, because you can sew the blocks together and you'll want to preserve that seam allowance and just keep the structure of the block. But the ones on the inside that aren't touching that last 1/4 inch border can all come out. I don't know if I can do this very well with one hand here because I'm holding the camera, but I just kind of get a fingernail in the middle and just start tearing and I probably will need both hands. Some of it might lift nicely because it's been sewn and folded several times, but you're just going to remove the inner paper, and you might want a pair of tweezers to get any little pieces that get stuck in the corner, but remove all the papers that aren't touching the border, and then that's just less to do next time. So you can see that came out pretty easily, and if you need to repress your seams after removing them, that's fine. So I'm just going to do that now, put the camera down so I can get these out a little easier. And there's a final shot of the back with all the inner paper pieces removed. It's just less to do later, and the outer papers will still hold the shape. Let me show you some of the other blocks I've made from the book, and I'll put the names of them on the screen, but I'll tell you what I learned while doing them. This was the first one I tried, and I tore all the paper off before sewing the segments together, just thinking I would have more control over the seam allowance. And so you can see some of my seams aren't quite as uniform. It still looks good. It'd be hard to tell looking at the front, but I just wasn't trusting yet the lining up of the papers, and so I just did it like regular piecing after I made the segments, just sewed them together without the papers. And so that made this block just shy of 6.5 inches, which is the unfinished size. My other blocks were 6.5 inches when I left the papers in. So just something to think about, because I know sewing the pieces together with paper attached can seem kind of different, and it's easy to fall back on what you know. This next one I sewed with the papers in, and I followed all the recommended directions, which included basting all the pieces down with a larger stitch within the seam allowance. Now this one, like I said, turned out to be 6.5 inches unfinished, but taking out all those basting stitches was a big pain, and I understand why. At least I think I know why they want the basting stitches in, because sometimes pieces can flip and get sewn down that you didn't want and you're taking them out. Basting would hold them in place. So this one I did exactly according to the directions, except again I removed all the paper. Now this one was mostly squares and rectangles, so I think the shape will maintain fine on this one. But as I kept going and was thinking about English paper piecing, leaving in the shape papers until you sew them into something, I thought I would try that with these. This was the last one I used the templates for. I had used the templates to cut out all these pieces, which takes a lot more time to get them exact. And like I said, some of them were just a little shy, so you can see the paper poking through in a few places. Not significantly. This will still all be caught in the seam allowance when it's sewn to sashing strips or other blocks. But it did make me think, you know what, I'm going to just start oversizing the pieces a bit, because I can see that it's not quite reaching where it needs to. But this is where I did start to keep the outer edge papers there, and just I have these pinned up on my board, and they're not, you know, curling in as much as, you know, these ones are trying to do. So this is the point where I started keeping the papers in, and then this is the first time I used the oversized pieces, and so you can see that and even with these odd shaped pieces here, they still were able to make it to the bottom, cover everything it needs to. And so I just had a little more success with that, using oversized pieces. And these ones, because of their strange shape, turning them and flipping them to see what they'd cover, you know, like putting the pin in there and flipping to see that it would cover, was really important to make sure you have the shapes oriented the right way when you turn it over and press. So those were my 4 that kind of led me to what I showed you today and some of the reasoning behind what I did today. Alright, you got to see how I've, through trial and error, figured out how to foundation paper piece in a way that makes sense to me and makes it go quickly. I hope if you've been on the fence about trying it, or you've steered clear of it because it just seemed too different from traditional piecing, that this tutorial makes it seem more approachable, and that you'll give it a shot, because you'll be able to make some beautiful blocks with it, whether it's from the Farmer's Wife book or other foundation paper piecing patterns. The method is going to be the same. I am by no means an expert in foundation paper piecing, and I encourage you to look at the directions in the Farmer's Wife book if that's what you plan on making in the future. There are very detailed directions in there, and I just made some modifications and just tweaked it where I needed to make sense to me and my skill set at this time. So watching tutorials like this one and other quilters and looking at their directions, you'll find what works for you. But I hope this made it seem a little more friendly to try. So now that you know how I'm going to be making the blocks, the videos here on out are going to be less tutorial based and less of me talking and more of bringing this era back to life. I'm going to be sharing some of the letters to the editor from the Farmer's Wife magazine, as well as share some images of the different articles and advertisements and things that were in the magazine, because looking through it, just seeing how different it was, whether it was prices or what the big stories were or the items they were advertising, I just found it all fascinating. And so I want to bring some of that into these videos, but mostly the women's voices of the time. Like I mentioned in my first video, it was a stressful time economically, and this magazine, the editors really focused on bringing forth the letters that brought hope and optimism and tried to inspire people during a challenging time. And goodness knows, in any decade we live in, there's always a need for inspiration and hope, and that we can get through it. And so I just love the spirit that was shared through so many of these letters, just of perseverance and hanging on to faith and hope, and that they'd make it through. And I want that to really shine in these upcoming videos while you watch these beautiful blocks come together. So each video I'll share a couple blocks, again not an in-depth tutorial, but you'll get to see them come together and see the results as I finish them. And so I'll just make them in batches and do a couple per video while I share the letters and the images. So stay tuned for that. I hope you're excited to just get a sense of what it was like to be a woman in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and may these blocks and these videos be a fitting tribute to the women of that era. So I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.